online as well. Welcome to the Geneva Press Club. This is a serious and important topic we are addressing this morning. We are glad to have with us today the World Organization Against Torture, OMCT, a Geneva-based NGO, for the launch of an innovative tool to combat torture worldwide. This important and innovative tool, developed by OMCT in collaboration with local civil society organizations and human rights defenders all over the world, bringing both difficult news but also hope, is called the Global Torture Index. Medias, journalists, human rights experts, all of you following us today are invited today to discover how this tool will empower the global anti-torture movement. It is a pleasure and an honor to have today with us our OMCT team, OMCT Secretary General Gerald Staberock, OMCT President Claudia Samayoa, and their panelists and guests. A Q&A session is planned after the panel talks. You can prepare your questions, written or spoken in English, also French, German, Spanish. Interviews of the OMCT team are welcome at the end, of course. And I'm glad to give the floor to you, Mrs. President Claudia Samayoa. You have the floor for the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for La Club Suisse de la Presse. For this space. Thank you, all of you, for being part of this discussion, both in person as well through the web page. So for us, it's an honor, a pleasure, a great motion to put forward this Global Torture Index. Why a Global Torture Index? Discussed today when we have the NATO meeting, when the drums of war, famine, and genocide are all over the news, is because we have a pending commitment as humanity. We decided many years ago, and when we signed and ratified the Convention Against the Torture, that torture should disappear. We managed to do this almost with the death penalty. But the 175 countries have not been able to eradicate torture. Why? That was the question we were saying. How do we make relevant torture again? Why it is so difficult for torture to disappear? And what we decided is we needed to do a different way of investigating torture. Not only the victims, not only the cases, but this systematic environment that allows torture to happen or to re-emerge even in societies that were supposedly out of torture or have combated torture. So in this, we have created this Global Torture Index, and you will find out from the panelists what an amazing tool. We still don't have the 175 countries there, but we will in time if the tool is deemed valuable. So to start, I would like you all to see this video that we have prepared for you.
Five countries have ratified the United Nations Convention Against Torture. Yet, torture still happens all too often, in prisons, during public assemblies, in armed conflict, and during day-to-day police interventions. Torture often happens in the shadows, making it incredibly difficult to identify and eradicate. It is used by public officials to control or punish individuals, extract information during interrogations, or discriminate against certain groups. Torture causes profound and lasting physical, emotional, and psychological harm to victims and to society as a whole. It undermines the rule of law and damages trust in state institutions. torture can never be justified. Torture and ill treatment are a global problem, but they are denied by states, silenced by police and military, and rarely brought to courts. Anyone could be exposed to it, including you or people you know. How can we, as a worldwide movement, put an end to torture once and for all, especially when it is so difficult to detect? The World Organization Against Torture and its network of over 200 members and partners have joined forces to bring torture out of the shadows and into the light through a global torture index. Local civil society organizations, human rights defenders, and international experts are working together to collect and analyze robust and trustworthy information from various countries, assessing compliance with international human rights standards. This data-driven tool is available from the 26th of June, 2025 on an interactive global torture index map, which regularly assesses the risk of torture in each country. Policymakers, governments, the media, international organizations, survivors, academia, civil society organizations, and beyond. Anyone engaged in eradicating torture can now explore human rights trends, access country-specific data, recommendations, and good practices, spread awareness, and contribute to change. Want to help us end torture? Start with solid and reliable data by using the Global Torture Index and learn how you can contribute to the global anti-torture movement.
So with that invitation, I leave you with Gerald Staberock, the Secretary General of the OMCT, who will just present the general insights of the global anti-torture global index. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
No, it's on.
It's on?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just take this. Maybe that's easier. Well, first of all, thank you for being here with us and also for those who are online with us. I will start with a very Genevan way. Post tenebras lux. All of you will know the slogan of Geneva here, which is light after darkness. And I think this is in a way describing what this index is about. It wants to give visibility to a global topic that is very rarely seen as a global topic. But if you look at countries around the world, at crises around the world, you will always see torture and impunity being part of what is happening. But torture is often in hiding. It's in police station, it's in detention, it's out of the public sight. And sometimes something that is not visible will not be cured. So one of the convocation of this global index indeed is to render this issue visible as a global issue. But also, if you have a sickness or disease, you go to the doctor and you get a prescription. We need to also see what is actually the disease before we give the prescription. We want to guide anti-torture reforms in countries through this index. We want to analyze where are the shortcomings, where are the risks of torture in different areas. The index is, and I think this is very important, it's a collective exercise. And you have some of the drivers of this collective exercise next to me here. But there are 90 organizations around the world, many of whom work directly with victims and survivors and have direct knowledge of where torture happens, in what context, and where the shortcomings are. So it's a collective exercise of the OMCT with its SOS Torture Network. I often say when you go to a doctor, you need you don't prescribe basically before you have seen the doctor and the analysis. So we really hope that this gives also the analysis on structural shortcomings. When you look at the countries that we have analyzed, there are at the moment 26 countries, which is a bit symbolic. We have June 26th, the UN Day for Victims of Torture tomorrow. So 26 countries for the first UN Day Victims of Torture with a global index. But obviously you will ask, why are there not other countries? Why are they selected? This is a first 26 countries. We want to scale this to a truly global index with our with our network. But we've chosen countries where we felt they are representative of different regions, they are representative of different problems we encounter, and where we have strong and reliable partner to test the methodologies that we've used for this index and developed over 2.5 years now. What are some of the insights or the outcomes? Well, obviously, not every country is the same. But there's no country among the 26 where there are no shortcomings. We have a scale from low risk to very high risk, and there's no country with low risk. There are countries with moderate risk, which means that there's no systematic torture, but torture occurs, and there are policy and legal challenges in this. There are, of course, countries that rate worse than others, and we hope that this is something that can be changed. There are 6 countries in particular that received the very high risk of torture rate. This includes a country like Libya. Just think about the torture in migration detention, but also by the different actors in Libya in total impunity. Think about Ethiopia. The conflict now, the torture that is rampant and used also in this context. Think about El Salvador. El Salvador, just think about the prisons now that are very in everybody's mind when you think about the people that are deported from the United States, but this signifies a very, very high risk of torture. Belarus, think about the demonstrations that took place a couple of years back, where torture was the signature piece to repression. Think about how people, and this is a big concern for us, how people in detention are not only detained to be deprived of liberty, but effectively psychologically destroyed while being in detention. Think about Bahrain, a country where torture is rampant, where torture happens especially against dissent, human rights defenders and others. And think also about the Russian Federation that scored with a very high risk, both in terms of the repressive detention system, but also quite a frequent practice in police stations, not to speak about Chechnya and other places. And in all of those, we see, of course, also that there are threats to civil society working on torture, and this is a convocation of this index as well to speak about this. We have other countries that have mixed results, but they're high risks despite sometimes strong legal frameworks in countries like India, Turkey, Nigeria, Tunisia, Mexico. And this shows also that in what I would call imperfect democracies, but still democracies, torture can occur. And of course, it has very different connotations. In India, I'm sure that Henri will speak about the relationship with the social disprivileged and torture. In Mexico, with impunity rates, despite a general anti-torture law that exists, and others. We have 4 countries with what we call considerable risk, including Argentina, where, of course, now with the policing context and the authoritarianism that comes, there are risks to torture. And we have countries with moderate risk, Italy, Spain, Moldova. I'm happy to give more information on those countries. What we want essentially is to assess also what are the key areas where improvements are needed. And we start with political commitment to torture. You know, you have countries that have promised to ratify the UN Torture Convention, like Malaysia and India, for many, many years here at the UN, but it never happened. You have countries like El Salvador, where there is a policy that is not for human rights at the moment. There is a questioning of universal human rights standards. We look into police behavior and brutality. This is both on the streets in terms of dissent demonstrations, but also in police custody, evidently. We look into the detention context, where we have seen many progresses over the years, but we also see now, with 15 countries that were rated high risk among the 26, that there's more and more either a lapidation of the prison system or an active punitive sense against people destroying their personality in prison. We have impunity, and we have the right to defend that we measure. One of the things, and victims' rights, and those are sort of together, because if you don't recognize victims and survivors as a start, you will not work effectively against torture. You deal with an abstract rather than a concrete. And we have some countries where there is complacency, but we also have some countries where you have the impression it's not only that justice is not done, but justice is prevented from being done by going against victims, harassing them when they use the right to complain, and by repressing human rights defenders that work for torture survivors and victims. So those are some of the issues that we have discovered. I invite you to go to the country pages for more details, but let's zero in a bit more with my colleagues on this.
Thank you, Gerald. Now I will give the floor to Veronica Hinestroza Arenas. She is an associate expert at Omega Research Foundation, is a consultant and advisor with over 22 years of experience in international human rights. Your space, Veronica.
It's on, right? Yeah, it is, no? Thank you, Claudia. Bonjour. Listen, torture is a peremptory norm of international law. That means that it can never, ever be derogated. Yet, only the UN Convention on Torture that we heard about through the video gave us a definition of what it is. And this is very important because it's the first treaty, binding treaty, that gives us that. And what it means, what it entails for countries that ratify the UN Convention is that they need to include this human rights violation as a crime in their criminal normative frameworks. As we heard and Gerald just mentioned, 2 of the 26 countries assessed through the index haven't yet ratified the UN Convention, and those countries are India and Malaysia. Still, even when countries ratify the convention, there is a long way to really eradicate torture. And we see that only 18 countries of those 26 had yet made it a crime, and only 15 had criminalized attempted torture. How can we have prosecutors and judges prosecuting and sanctioning torture if it is not yet a crime at the domestic level? How can they comply with an obligation that is not only legal, but moral? They do morally, ethically need to protect the dignity of every person, of every citizen of the population as a whole. So this is a key topic to look at, but also it's alarming that the index shows that 65% of the countries assessed still allow for amnesties on a crime that is absolutely forbidden. And why is this a concern? Because in no context should a public official, a law enforcement official, be allowed to inflict pain or suffering into anyone to obtain information, which we know will be unreliable, because science tells us that torture is not only illegal and unethical, but it doesn't work, or to obtain a confession, or to punish, or to discriminate. Imagine, law enforcement officials are meant to enforce the law. Committing torture is going against that law. Now, there's another very important document that we need to talk about, and is the optional protocol to the convention. That optional protocol creates the national mechanisms that are meant to monitor places of detention. This protocol looks particularly at situations of detention. And only 14 of the 26 countries assessed have created that national preventive mechanism. Colombia, I have to say, my own country, still behind. We only ratified the optional protocol in April, so we still don't have a national preventive mechanism to visit places of detention. Now, torture doesn't only happen in places of detention, and this is important to know, to realize, and I think for you, journalists in particular, is key, because we see through reporting, live, through social media, torture taking place in police operations. In normal police operations, but also when they intervene in peaceful protests, but also at border control. The index shows us that 50% of the countries assessed still allow firearms to be used on a constant basis. Indonesia, Libya, the Philippines, and Ethiopia are among those countries. And we find that, for example, in Honduras and Argentina, death through these police operations using lethal weapons is very common. Now, we need to think that it's not only through lethal weapons that this happened. There's a huge misuse of less lethal weapons, that it's normalized. People are being tortured with tear gas canisters, with rubber bullets. We see people losing their eyes in protests because of a misuse of less lethal weapons. And again, as I mentioned, it also happens at the borders. Excessive use of force is frequent in Libya, Spain, Belarus, Tunisia, Hungary, Belarus and Hungary at the border. And I mean, people already face a very difficult situation when they have to leave their country to find death or torture, by law enforcement officials at the border. So we should all be very concerned about this. And the index is amazing because, as it has been said, it makes the invisible visible. It shows us that torture is not only what we think, it's not only pain and suffering, which is already terrible, but it has all these dimensions that are hidden and that are so important to look at and to report and to protect and to be against. It's an invitation for countries to start assessing, their compromise and to start also producing data. And it gives us a fantastic tool to monitor and to create awareness about something that we should all be against, because it's about protecting human dignity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. And now I have the very great pleasure to present you Dr. Uju Agomoh. She is the chair of the steering committee of the Global Index Against Torture. So she is also the executive director of Prisoner Rehabilitation and Welfare Action, PRAWA. Dr. Uju is also a member of the United Nations Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture, SPT. She has been author and co-author of over 30 books, and she definitely has steered us to have this excellent scientific global index. So, your word, Dr. Uju.
Okay, thank you very much. When you were watching the video, you saw the clip that mentioned clearly that this is a global problem. It is truly a global problem. It is also demanding a global solution. And I think that one of the greatest things that we're doing here today is how we can ensure that everybody understands that we need a collective responsibility. We need everyone to see that there is something they can do to add to that solution. And I think this is the beauty of this global torture index. It's not only about knowing all of the issues, making them visible. It is also how each player, how both people working on ground in the various countries, at regional level and also on international level, can begin to see how progress can be made, both in terms of the improvement on these issues. So the figures tell us something. And if you look, there are certain things that are already known and certain things that this index is helping us to do. Let me give you some few examples of this. The very first is that we already know that during the first hours that someone is in detention, it's most vulnerable period. We need to look at clear safeguards. It is recognized that a lot of torture happened during this period. But of the 26 countries that were surveyed, just about 5 of them recorded that actually have surveillance where people are in places of detention, especially in the police detention. I will also mention some of those countries. I mean, you look at countries like Spain, like Honduras, like Moldova. But also, I think you could also look at a country like the Kazakhstan. But there is something that is important and I need to mention, like if you take a country like Nigeria, which is my country, you have a situation where sometimes in the law they will indicate that you should record any period you have having interrogations. But sometimes you have these laws and they are not implemented. But yet, here is important to be able to look at how these things apply. The other point is about how many people actually have access to persons who are in detention. A lot of countries reported, and I think close to about 55% of those that were surveyed reported that persons can be incommunicado. They are not allowed to have access to their lawyers. They are not allowed to have access to their families. And in many instances, even organizations that have oversight functions are not able to assess them. Some of those countries, will have them also mentioned here, and I will give you some few examples of this. Some of them are Cameroon. You will see countries such as Mexico, Pakistan. You will see also countries like India, DRC, which is Democratic Republic of Congo, and some of the other countries. Ethiopia is also yet another. Let me quickly mention 3 other important points. One is about issue about the detention conditions and some of the groups of persons that are very vulnerable. Deaths in custody have been recorded, and we find that over 120% of the countries report having to detain persons beyond the capacities that those facilities are designated. And you know, so many problems come out of those kind of issues. Children is yet another category of people that we need to look at. A lot of children report that they've experienced torture while in detention, and we do also know that there are instances where children are also detained together with adults. The other point I would want to flag here is the issue around access. What kind of access do people who are in places of detention experience? How many of these facilities are civil society organizations allowed to visit? Many of the countries will note that there are even instances of countries where you do not know all of the places of detention. Therefore, statistics regarding even the number of persons who are in detention at any given time becomes also problematic. But we have had some countries where clearly it's been found that civil society are not allowed to have access, and from the result, you can see there about close to 45% of those countries. You see countries such as Malaysia, Libya, Spain, Russian Republic, Ethiopia, Bahrain, Pakistan, El Salvador, Spain, and the rest of that. But interestingly, let me just mention that there have been instances where there is integration of both civil society and government in terms of having monitoring mechanisms. And countries where we have found this to happen include Argentina and Italy, where clearly this have actually been indicated itself that such independent visits need to include both civil society and government agencies. The last point I would like to make is about data. Data is very important. And I think that part of one of the key things that we gain out of this global torture index is that it's providing us a framework, a mechanism that will enable us to collect data in a better way. Many of the countries do not disaggregate their data in terms of helping us understand what is happening around this spectrum. Interestingly, Nigeria has been flagged here as a country where, of all of the ones that were surveyed, seem to be a little bit more accessible regarding data. But yet, there's still problems. There's still problems that need to be addressed. Let me conclude by saying the importance of enhancing quality as well as the frequency of reportage on this issue is critical. And this is where I see the strength of journalists and the strength of all of those who work in terms of enhancing the public awareness around this space. We found that where the frequency and the quality of information that is given to a particular issue is done, we find out that a lot of time policymakers tend to pay attention. So I sign off by asking, that your support in ensuring that many people understand how difficult these issues are, how global the problems are, how the solutions also require global intervention, and how important the Global Torture Index is in terms of ensuring that many more people do something to help us combat torture. So thank you very much, and we hope that after this meeting, perhaps more steps from all of us will make this a better solution. Thank you again for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Uju. And lastly but not least, Henri Tiphagne, he has been for many, many years a member of the SOS anti-torture movement. And he is the co-founder of the non-profit organization People's Watch in India. He has over 29 years of expertise in human rights. And he is also a member of the steering committee. His valuable knowledge and wisdom is part that had made this possible. So thank you, Henri, and you have your word now.
Friends, I'm proud to say that I'm a part of the SOS Torture Global Network. And it is through such networks that we draw inspiration for our local networks, which fight torture on a day-to-day basis on the ground. I represent here 6 of the 26 countries from Asia who have been examined. And I'm proud to say that I'm from India, the world's largest democracy, which has been shamed by this torture index saying we have not yet ratified the UN Convention Against Torture. We have 170 national and state human rights institutions in our country, and yet on the issue of torture, we have not come forward. With 4 UPR sittings that we have had and over 41 countries that have recommended, we are yet to ratify the Convention Against Torture. With over 32 years of existence, the National Human Rights Commission in India has not been able to prosecute one single police officer responsible for extrajudicial killings or torture in our country. And that speaks why there are continuous reprisals globally on people who venture into, moving into, challenging the torture that they have undergone. And they do it at great risks to their lives. And this is being discouraged at different levels, at the initial level of the police station up to even the judiciary. They all face reprisals, they all face intimidations. And we have in this torture index, we see 8 countries that have been indicated for this, like Honduras, Libya, Belarus, Colombia, Philippines, Turkey, and of course India. And I want to recall that a few days ago was the 5th anniversary of a father and a son who were tortured and who died in judicial custody. They were produced after medical examination in my country. They were produced before a judicial magistrate who was not able to identify that they had already changed their clothes 3 times because they were bleeding. And the trial has gone for 5 years, 262 hearings, and the trial is still on. And the 9 police officers, luckily because of a local movement which has been highlighting this issue, the trial is on. But the family is facing reprisals. And stories like this will be multiplied in different countries who are members of the OMCT. Medical examination has been made compulsory in many countries. We ourselves have laws, we have judicial verdicts which say it is compulsory that before a post-mortem is commenced, the body has to be seen by the family members. The post-mortem certificate and the video has to be given. It is never done so. The post-mortem halls are supposed to be covered with CCTV cameras. It is never done so. Victims are not provided the support they need and the rehabilitation that they are supposed to provide, excepting in 2 countries where psychological support has been provided, like Mexico and Hungary. The last point I want to highlight is on the human rights defenders who face the risk. You have a huge volume of defenders across the country who are tortured, and torture is used as a weapon to see that they do not pursue their human rights defenders' work at play. In my own country, you have a whole series of high-profile cases who are supported by international organizations. We have Khurram Parvez from Jammu and Kashmir, who is in custody for 4 long years. You have 16 accused from different professions, known as the famous Bhimo Koregaon case, where they are in custody for a long period of time, and 5 years the trial has not begun. You have women, Adivasi women like Soni Sori, who have faced the worst type of torture from 2005 onwards. She has lost her husband, and still she fights to ensure that Adivasi land continues. Human rights defenders are always tortured. And we want to ensure that this torture index is another weapon, not only to be used at the international level, but to draw inspiration from other countries so that the movements in our respective countries gain strength, and we ensure that together we will be able to ensure that we are able to abolish torture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henri. So now it's the moment for the questions and answers. I invite the people that are on the web page on Zoom that they can write their questions so we can read them here and make an address. And of course, let's start with you, people in the public. Who has a question? So I'll start with you, sir.
Yeah, just wait a moment till we get the microphone.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll take our first questions here in the front. Sir?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the presentations. They were really very enlightening. And to understand my questions, I would like to present myself. I'm the chair of the NGO Committee on Aging and representative to the United Nations of the International Federation of Aging, and member of GAROP, the Global Alliance for the Right of Older Persons. I noticed that children were mentioned, but older persons, are they included? That's an issue. And I'm also a gender champion. So can we make a difference and mention what is the situation of women in the whole process? And good news, after 14 years of discussion in New York of the open-ended working group on aging without any result, the agenda was transferred to Geneva, and here at the Human Rights Council in the spring session, there was a resolution adopted to start drafting a convention on the rights of older persons. And this is an invitation. I think we should be in contact, and you should be involved so that the issue is considered and possibly reflected in that convention in one way. So there's a very active group of friends of older persons in Geneva that I'm sure that they will welcome your inputs at any time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Who'd like to answer this? Mr. Secretary General?
Well, first of all, thank you for the perspective, and I think it's good to see that the work on this convention is taken forward here in Geneva, so this has our support. I don't think we have measured specifically elderly people in this context, but there is, for example, when you think about the preventive mechanisms, you have, for example, one of the recommendations that always comes is the ratification of the optional protocol to the Torture Convention, which provides visits to places deprived of liberty. But when they go to countries, they also go to psychological homes. They might also look when they visit places at AMS, at the elderly people's homes. So there are aspects, but it's probably an area to explore more. We know other categories of vulnerable situations of vulnerability. Children is one of those. Women certainly is another one. We have specifically one category here in the torture index methodology, which is looking at what we call the protection of all, because we do know that torture is always me and the other. me and the criminal, me and the ethnic other group, very often me and the poor. So we know that the torture happens especially against marginalized communities, underserved communities. So there is a very strong connection to the social impact also with poverty and others and social exclusion. So it's I think, a good point to reflect on how we can bring this in more.
Thank you. Second question here, sir.
Thank you. My name is Peter Kenny. I work for All Africa Global News. I'm just interested in looking at your map there of the countries that you surveyed, and most of them are in the lesser developed world, and this is a developmental question. Is there a linkage between development and torture? Is torture more prevalent in developed countries or less developed countries? Thank you.
Maybe I start, but I invite Dr. Ujo or others to join because you have probably the more detailed knowledge of how it plays out in your countries as well. I think there's a clear connection between the two. Number one, I don't think that you can achieve a sustainable development if we start from that, if you have a country that tolerates torture and has impunity for torture. Number one, the SDGs itself have, with indicator 16, a very clear indicator that includes torture as one of the elements. But also, as I explained earlier with the previous question, torture happens against marginalized communities. And it is a sign that something is wrong in society. We want this index actually also to be seen as a risk index for other areas. Is it safe to invest in that country? Is development happening if you have communities that are excluded, that are suffering from torture, from impunity? Will development really happen if there's no trust in law enforcement because they are not your friend, they are your enemy, or you're afraid of them? So I think there's a very clear relationship between development and human rights, and development and the prohibition of torture. But I leave it to colleagues to say more on this. But I would like to add that we have, of course, also looked at other countries like Italy and Spain. And you see also in countries that we qualify as developed, torture can occur. There are risk areas. And there's maybe also a dangerous departure from commitment to universal human rights standards.
Okay, thank you very much. So the very first thing I would like to remind us about is the full name, the title. If you look at, it says United Nations Convention Against Torture, Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading Treatment or Punishment. Same also for the optional protocol. So many a times, I think it's important also that people understand that there are certain conditions that you see where people's rights are deprived, and you find that a lot of time countries that are struggling with resources, most of the resource-constrained countries, you may find more of those situations. For example, if you go to detention facilities in places like Democratic Republic of Congo, like Burundi, and also like countries like Nigeria, in some instances, that you'll be amazed in terms of the degree of deprivation that happens, which of course a lot of times that things that people face in terms of also what the police and other law enforcement agencies and the military do. So it is one aspect, but I think I would also want to caution, if we look at torture as only happening to countries where there are resource constraints, that's the challenge. That would not be correct. And this is why you see the Global Torture Index seen as talking about global protection, global solution. So in every country, this will enable us to understand what is the nature, the trend. What is the nature of torture that you see here? Is it among people who are migrants? Is it among people who are detained in the police stations or detained in prisons or custodial centers, as it were? So again, the degree may differ, the nature of its presentation may differ, but it is important that we see this as a global issue. So every country, let's have a closer view to ask where are persons most vulnerable to issues about torture, to issues about cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Which kind of population do we see as more vulnerable to these circumstances? That's just what I would like to say.
Thank you. Sir, here.
Yes. Before asking my question, two caveats. First, I have very bad hearing, so I rely mostly on what I could read. And secondly, I consider OMCT a heavenly, angelic organization, in spite of my very nasty questions I'm going to ask now. So first, I was surprised to read in the leaflet on the fact sheet about Spain a reference to Pegasus. So one may approve or most likely disapprove of the use of Pegasus. In any case, there is no Interpol agent here to enter the debate. But I consider that there is only an indirect or very, very, very indirect relation between Pegasus and torture. This is my first remark or question. Second, I also read that lawyers defending victims were fleeing en masse from Spain. Not quite en masse, but I mean, you made it a point. Are we closer to the situation in the time of Franco or in a context like Close Croissant? This is my second question. The third one, you say that torture occurs in the shadow. Yes, it is perpetrated in the shadow, but it doesn't remain very long there, because in today's world, there are families, there are media, there are leagues, there are OMCT, which mean, do you really think that it's committed in the shadow, unless, like my colleague said, I'm a journalist freelance, in the countries which are not listed in your list. And last, you refer to marginalized communities. And there my question will be horrendous and I will be thrown out of this room. Shouldn't we consider police a marginalized community? I have never seen in Geneva a demonstration against violence against police. There is not a single organization advocating that. And I have checked online what happened in Buenos Aires in March. The violence is much, I mean, the rights and wrongs are much less one-sided as you claim. So these are my four nasty reactions, although I will still go on revering OMCTs are one of the best and most useful organizations on earth.
Thank you for the questions. Who'd like to start? There is Spain, Shadow.
I can take some and then...
Yes, please, Dr. Agomoh.
Let me start with the two issues. The issue about violence against the police. I think oftentimes you hear the police also talk about human rights versus themselves. You think about what about the rights of the police? But the truth is, it's about human beings. Police officers are also human beings. So when we talk generally about observance of human rights, it's about observance of rights, including the rights of the police. The truth is that when an organization have the instrumentality of force, you have ammunition, versus somebody who doesn't have, you know that the balance usually is of this nature. But I think it is important, and I give an example. In 2020, we had the EndSARS, which was a protest of a lot of young people and others saying no to the violations and torture that were being carried out by a particular segment of the police, which is the Special Anti-Robbery Squad of the Nigerian Police. I was a member of the EndSARS panel, the panel that looked at the complaints that came. There were instances where some police officers were also even attacked by fellow police officers. So, and when it came to about the decisions were not only for for just the civilians. So the point here is that, yes, the bulk of the people who had suffered were the civilians. But in the instance where a police officer was also attacked by other police officers, we also looked at that issue. So again, it is to say that it is just basically in terms of looking at the instrumentality of force and power. So when you talk about somebody who has, you have access to instruments of power that can inflict power, it's always different. So again, it's usually how people is seen. But I would tell you that I do know instances where the rights of police officers have been defended. But just think about somebody who has the rifle and another person who doesn't have that. There was a point also I wanted to address, the issue about it occurring in the shadow. Torture occurs in the shadow, but does not remain there. You are correct. But the reason why we talk about it in the shadow, a lot of times people are being tortured in police stations. People are being tortured in dark rooms. People are being tortured outside the view of many. But increasingly, we're also seeing it out, but not to the same degree. When you see people having protests, you still see people, being tortured outside. But a lot of times, those people who are being tortured are tortured outside the views of the generality of the people. And that's why the issue around documenting this torture is important. That's why some of those issues that you're even calling professionals, doctors, in terms of what the Istanbul Protocol teaches us, psychologists, medical doctors, lawyers, to be able to document as much as possible. But a lot of those incidents happen where many people are not seeing them. But you are correct. The families who suffered, but again, it is when some of those families are bold enough to come out. There are a lot of the families that are still in the shadows. They are still so frightened. So bearing in mind that the much we see outside, there's still a lot that are behind closed doors, that's behind the walls, that we don't see, that we don't know.
Thank you. I think there was a point about Spain.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Maybe
who's
I
going to
start,
answer?
but also if you want to comment at some point. Okay. I start maybe with the last point about in the shadows and how difficult it is to ensure accountability. We have presently a global week against torture with all our network, and we had a session at the start of this with torture survivors. And I think if you put yourself into the shoes of a torture survivor, to come forward with your complaint is a very, very difficult task. And this links me to Spain to some extent, because if you look at the Spanish analysis, there are a number of points that were raised on Spain. One is, for example, that in the law on victims, torture victims are not included. There's no recognition of torture victims guaranteeing their legal right to rehabilitation to start with. There are issues also in terms of the legal definition of torture in the criminal law that is not compliant with the UN Torture Convention according to the Committee Against Torture. There are statute of limitations. There are amnesties. So there's a whole range of issues in the legal environment. There are lack of safeguards in national security detention in terms of access to lawyer and others. And yes, we do measure also what is the right to protect from torture, and there we look at what are the threats to civil society. There were cases of informal, informants that were infiltrated into the human rights organizations and discussions. Pegasus was used politically, but Pegasus was also used against human rights defenders, and that is unacceptable. So it is an element in this. But there is indeed a much broader range of issues that led us to the consideration that there is a moderate risk in torture. And one of them is historic impunity. You had various episodes of torture in Spain that are well documented, where cases have come to the European Court of Human Rights or others, but there is a lack of recognition of victims and chronic issues of impunity. And this is something that we see globally as an issue. I sometimes use a comparison. You have a car, you drive the car, you do a law, you change policies, but when it comes to accountability and impunity, it's like you always put the handbrake on, so your car doesn't really move forward. And that's what we see in so many countries. And I think in Spain, this is what led to the evaluation of a moderate risk, which is the best country that we have in some way here. But it says that there are concrete problems both in the law and in practice.
Okay, another compliment before we take an online question. So, Veronica.
Thank you. Yeah, to complement the issue on police, I mean, it's not only that they have weapons, it's that the countries ratified the convention because the prohibition of torture is on the states, and the police represent states. It's different from civil society, from people, right? What they do against the police is a crime. When the police use pain and suffering to obtain something from an individual to achieve a goal, then that is torture. And that it's the responsibility of the states to keep it prohibited. State officials cannot use that. And it's also not the same. I always get, it's always very interesting to see that we equate pain and suffering to torture. It's not just pain and suffering. Torture is when pain and suffering are instrumentalized to obtain an illegal objective, right? So you know if you inflict severe pain and suffering on someone, you do it because you want to get information through that pain and suffering, or you want a confession, or you want to discriminate, or you want to punish. So it's that use of the pain and suffering for a purpose that is illegal, and it's illegal for the authorities to get. It's particularly illegal for the authorities. I'm not saying violence against police shouldn't be condemned. It should, and it should be prosecuted as a crime. Now, the topic of the shadows, I completely agree with Dr. Hugo, but aside from the fact that sometimes comes out to light, many times when we see it out in light, live, as I was saying, in protest, for example, we normalize it. We see the use of force sometimes as necessary, sometimes as proportional, because if the other side maybe has weapons, then it's proportional. No, that's not what the legal use of force is. And we need to stop normalizing it and seeing that when you use weapons that are meant to be used in a particular way, not to deter, not to stop someone from harming someone else, from depriving someone from life, but to cause pain and suffering to punish. To punish why? Because you're out there protesting, right? Because you're against a policy or against a government. It's used, that pain and suffering and those weapons in an inadequate way to produce, aside from the pain and suffering that they will cause to stop someone when needed, to cause additional pain and suffering. Why would you shoot someone on the eye with a rubber bullet? They are not designed for that, you know? So there's an intention there. And we need to stop normalizing police violence and start seeing it as torture when it is torture and when it is also ill treatment. Yeah, I think that's it. You want?
Thank you.
I'll come later.
Okay, so we will read an online questions. Claudia, Samayoa, please, you have the floor to read the questions.
Thank you. We just have one question. And it's, why have we studied only 26 countries? And if it would not have been better to wait before publication to have more countries? This is a question of a journalist of the Agence for France Press. And it is a key question. Do you want to answer it?
Well, our answer to this is, yes, this is 26 countries, but this is the beginning of a process where we hope we will move from 26 onwards gradually up. These are also 26 countries where we have our members. And as was said by the Secretary General in the beginning, in these 26 countries, there were 90 participating organizations which participated. So it is not only for us the countries that matter, it is the larger movement which participates which also matters. And therefore, I think it has to be gradual. This is the first state of 26 countries. Regionally, we have been able to select countries. We have ensured to a certain extent that our members are also represented, but this is a very humble beginning. But it is a definite building that we will move forward, and this will largely depend on a global movement of people on the ground who are contributing to this process of monitoring the further countries that will come. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take another question in the room here. Sir.
I have two sets of questions. One relates to the methodology and the second relates to India, where I come from. I think let me get the India questions first. There must be a reason why India has not ratified this convention. India is not a country which does not take up these things seriously. Whether logical or illogical, what is that reason India has not ratified this convention? I was quite startled with the fact, which I came to know only a few months back, that of the total number of detainees in India in the prisons, 2/3 are the under trials. So it's only 1/3 which is because they have been convicted. 2/3 means bulk of them have not even seen through the trial process, which can run into years. And more startling was 2 weeks back when there was a newspaper report that one person was released by the Supreme Court after 48 years of detention. For me, this is extreme. As an Indian, I'm shocked. I'm quite a balanced person or this thing. Now, getting into the methodology, did your methodology include the historical evolution in a particular country? Situation now may be bad, but has it evolved in last 10 years, 20 years? Like a country may look very bad on some attribute, but 10 years back, if it was very high risk, now it is high risk, I'll consider it a progress. Because sometimes inter-country comparison may not capture the full story. And the second part about the methodology is, normally you take torture as physical torture, mental torture, but does it include economic torture also, like extracting financial things like bribing, expecting bribes? Because I have seen it myself that it leads to a mental damage also when you are extracted a substantial amount of money for no fault of yours. Does your I won't say definition, does it include within the framework of torture?
Thank you. About India first, who'd like to answer that?
A question which is also in my mind, and therefore I'm not a profound representative of the government of India to be able to answer this, but in all honesty, let us search for an answer. In 1997, the UN Convention Against Torture was signed by India. 97. And that was at the instance of the National Human Rights Commission of India, putting pressure on India, saying that it is high time, when our Supreme Court has categorically held that torture is illegal, then ratifying the Convention Against Torture should be natural. This was the position of the government when it signed in 1997. As I said earlier, 1997 to 2025 has been a long journey where now with the UPRs, 4 UPRs have gone, 2 reports before the International Convention, the Human Rights Committee has gone, and yet we have not ratified. Now what has happened in between? Due to pressure of people's organizations within the country, there was definitely in 2010 a bill introduced in Parliament with 7 clauses attempting that the torture prevention would take place. We opposed it. We opposed it collectively across the country, and therefore it went to a parliamentary select committee, and then it died a natural death there. So that is in terms of domestic law. Recently in 2023, we had the Indian Criminal Procedure Code, the Indian Evidence Act, and the Indian Penal Code being amended. That was an opportunity at the doorstep for those in governance to see that they put into action what the global community had been bringing out. But nay, that was not used as an opportunity. So, under trials in prison, yes, that is the truth. But the judgments of the Supreme Court are exactly to the contrary. Ensure that under trials in prisons who have overstayed more than 50% of their time, total time of the the offenses that they are supposed to be punished with maximum are released, but it doesn't take place. So these are all standards which are there, established by the Supreme Court of India, but determined not to be followed by prison authorities at different levels. And the last was, of course, you pointed out the case, a startling case, and there are many more startling cases of this sort. So India is a country which has to bow down in shame, because we are perhaps the only country globally which has a gamut of national human rights institutions, as I pointed out. And despite these institutions being in place, to ensure that these institutions are not functioning and not taking up cases of torture in the manner it should be taken up, that is something serious. One more point to add, and we say it with pain, such a large country had its National Human Rights Commission downgraded very recently in Geneva. Therefore, there's tons of work to be done by the government along with civil society. Civil society is always willing to work with the government to ensure that these minimum standards are maintained. One more point I wanted to say in general is these 26 countries have been evaluated on the basis of a variety of international established standards. And those are the standards which were before us when we looked at each of the countries. And those standards, I think, is something which is very important, that it is against those standards that this assessment has been made. I think this is an opportunity to say so. Thank you.
Okay, who'd like to answer the methodologic part of economical torture?
I'll answer the methodology question. Is quite easy. It's impossible to make an evaluation if you don't have a process, the extensive history of the country. So yes, as you have heard, we have to analyze what has happened. Signature, ratification, court decisions, and those happen on time, during the time. And just to tell you, there are countries that evolve very slowly, but then we have countries like El Salvador that did a U-turn very recently. So you have to also attest for that. What has been lost? And I wanted to share something about this idea of shadow. Torture occurs in the shadow. People try to get the voice out. But one of the phenomena that has been really concerning us and OMCT and in the network is the fact that more and more people that speak out against torture are at the same time attacked and sometimes tortured. So it is a very violent cycle, the one that we are trying to stop. That is why the global index is a process where we are inviting you to come on board. It's a scientific process. We should have that map finished, regardless if we are talking of Finland or United States of America. That is pretty much one of the drivers of torture in my region. So we have to document. It's not only to have it in our list, is to have the ability to document seriously. And that's what these 26 countries start. And it has been an effort of years since we first thought of the index, because it has been an effort of doing the environment. So that's why we talk about a global commitment, but specifically, and this is very important, a moral commitment. How do we measure the moral commitment of humanity to really stop torture? Because we can have conventions, treaties, we can have Supreme Court decisions, but if change doesn't happen, we will continue to have torture in the shadows. And then we will have victims and advocates and physicians also in the shadows. That's why we decided to do this. After 40 years of existence, we need to break the silence in a way that is credible. And please go into the index tomorrow. Go inside, it's an interactive tool, and you will be able to see the seriousness of what has been done, and I hope that you will start seeing new countries coming. And let's see if what idea of developed countries we have is what developed countries mean. That developed countries shouldn't allow torture. There's no space for torture. So if a so-called developed country, as my friend Henri says, democratic country, still allows torture and 40-something years of prison, are we talking about a developed country? So let's challenge also the idea of how torture intertwines with what we conceive as developed country.
Thank you.
There was a question about economic torture. And when I heard it, I just smiled. So I just want to say something. When you look at Article 1 of the United Nations Convention Against Torture, Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading Treatment, which actually defines what torture is within the framework of the UN, you will see the word physical use, you will see the word psychological use. But I then wanted to mention that perhaps if because of your economic condition, when we talked about vulnerabilities and marginalized people, then it's a different dimension. Or if you look at what becomes the economic implication of people who have been tortured, because oftentimes this have also implications on their livelihood and all of that they have to suffer over a long time. So I just wanted to mention the fact that Article 1 speaks about physical and psychological torture. But we know that when people have been tortured, there are certain consequences that may come out of it in terms of economic and all the rest of that, just to bear that in mind. And perhaps to say something regarding the uniqueness of the Global Torture Index in the sense that it empowers the country to also self-evaluate itself, by itself. You can look at it. It's not just saying someone else is telling you are not complying in this direction. You and the different institutions within the country can look at this as a process that can help build their capacities, help ensure that they can monitor the progress they themselves are making. So which actually adds also additional value. Thank you. I just didn't want to skip off that concept of economic torture.
Yes. Veronica, Hinestroza.
Thank you. Yeah, on the record of countries and how far they have gotten, I really like the index because it has some of the indicators are able to tell us a lot about the story of how countries have progressed or not. And a couple that I really invite you to look at are transparency and access to information, because this shows us, how a country has been working on making visible their efforts to eradicate torture. And my work is primarily with state institutions. I work a lot with the judiciary, with public defenders, with prosecutors, and sometimes they come to me very excited. I was like, I release a person because I found that in the process, the information obtained and used against this person was obtained through torture. So I excluded this information, which is their obligation. And that doesn't get recorded anywhere. There is no indicator of those cases being properly decided with the standards in the Convention Against Torture by a judge or a prosecutor, stopping an investigation because of this and turning it around a state official. So I think that the index should also be looked at in this light, an opportunity, an invitation for states to start reporting on what they're doing right. Not only ratifying the convention, but how in each of its elements, because there are a lot of standards there, they are achieving progress, and they deserve that recognition when that happens. And the other indicator I very much like is that one of rule of law and democracy. And I leave it with what Claudia mentioned about what is development and what is not, but it's a very interesting one to look at. Now on the issue of economic torture, I don't know if I understood the question in a different way, but if someone is tortured, if someone is a victim of an official that inflicts pain or suffering, whether physical or psychological, to obtain, for example, money, you have the elements of the definition of torture, because the definition of torture has prohibited purposes: discrimination, coercion, obtaining information, obtaining confession, discrimination, or any other. So, you need to look at it considering all the elements of torture. So if you have them, yes, it's possible to look at it from that perspective as well. And I think that's a very important, if it was in that way that you ask, I think it's a very important question, because one of the problems we see is that many times torture is only considered when there's a confession involved. And that's not the case. It's used, as I was saying, for many other purposes, and more and more as punishment. So when you ask about women, for example, we see in protest, they are not only punished for being against a policy or a government, they're punished for daring to go out of their house to protest, So there are many purposes, illegal purposes, because of which pain and suffering are instrumentalized. And I think that question allowed to bring this to light. Thank you.
Thank you. Nous avons une question en français ici, monsieur.
Bonjour. Je m'excuse, je suis le président de l'Observatoire mauritanien des droits de l'homme. Et bon, j'ai assisté, en fait, j'ai peu entendu parce que je ne parle pas bien l'anglais. Et quand même, j'ai compris qu'il s'agit d'un processus, si j'ai bien compris, un processus continu d'observation, en quelque sorte, pour mettre en place un indice sur la torture au niveau international. Est-ce que c'est ça? Parce que j'ai entendu que vous avez seulement numéré ici 26 pays, c'est lesquels vous avez évalué leur niveau de torture. Bon, je suis de la Mauritanie et je vois que le pays du Sahel connaissent la torture d'une manière jamais vue dans le monde. Et je n'ai pas vu que vous avez parlé de l'un de ces pays-là, ni le Mali, ni la Mauritanie, ni le Sénégal, ni même le Maroc, ni la Tunisie, qui sont un peu moins que l'autre partie subsaharienne, mais quand même, ça existe toujours la torture. Donc, je veux savoir, est-ce que c'est un processus continu avec lequel on peut nous joindre pour qu'ensemble, nous mettons la lumière sur la torture dans ces pays-là? Est-ce que c'est continu? Est-ce qu'on peut avoir toujours la chance de votre accompagnement, de votre assistance, pour qu'ensemble, nous pouvons faire la lumière sur les cas qui se passent en Mauritanie, qui sont vraiment bizarres, et jamais que vous ne pouvez pas croire, de telle sorte que même les mécanismes de prévention de la torture sont devenus complices. Et les comités des droits de l'homme sont complices avec les gouvernements. Donc, les militants des droits de l'homme sont torturés partout, sont intimidés. Et parfois même, il y en a quelques-uns qui ont été tués dans les prisons, dans les commissariats. Donc, personne ne peut parler. Et on voit que le monde, comme si rien ne se passe de l'autre côté. Voilà, et donc ma question est, est-ce qu'ensemble on peut continuer pour que nous pouvons donner la chance aux Mauritaniens, aux Maliens, ces gens-là qui sont là-bas, pour qu'au moins ils font un peu la lumière sur ce qui se passe. Ok, merci.
Merci pour cette question. Je réponds, je crois. Vous avez tout à fait raison. On a un grand souci sur le Sahel et la torture et l'environnement aussi de la défense des droits humains dans cette région. C'est mon collègue Isidore qui est devant vous, qui travaille beaucoup sur la région, aussi des visites sur le terrain avec les partenaires. Donc, le fait que ces pays ne font pas partie des premières ébauches de cet index global sur la torture veut, dans aucun sens, dire qu'il n'y a pas de problème. Bien au contraire, la convocation de cet index autour des années, ça sera augmenter les pays qui sont mentionnés Et certainement, on a des soucis sur la torture dans votre région et on va travailler avec les défenseurs des droits humains dans la région pour intégrer ces pays-là, parce que je crois, effectivement, on voit la torture dans beaucoup de dimensions dans cette région-là. On voit aussi une rétraction dans l'engagement pour les droits humains et les standards internationaux. On voit la torture un peu partout. On les voit dans les routes migratoires, on les voit dans les stations des police. Et je crois que c'est des pays qui feront certainement partie d'un index dans les années à venir.
Merci, nous arrivons au terme de cette conférence de presse. We're getting to the end of this press conference, and I give back the floor to Mrs. President of OMCT for the conclusion word. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for the very interesting questions, discussion we had during the last minutes. Let me just finish saying this torture we have to bring to light collectively. Nobody can do it alone. This is a global problem, therefore it demands global solution. And it's, I think one of the things, we need laws, but we need more compliance. We need commitment, but we need moral clarity to be able to walk together and eradicate torture as we had promised when we signed and ratified the convention. So thank you very much for all of you. Thank you for my fellow speakers and members of the OMCT network and of the steering committee. And again, thank you a lot for the Club Suisse de la Presse, for this space for us and for the patience of those that are in Zoom that I know that sometimes it's difficult to hear us. So thank you very much.
La ciudad me abraza en su calor, es mi ritmo, mi tierra.